Wendy, it is indeed my pleasure and honor to be invited to participate in this long seminar, some of which I've been trying to follow. And it's truly a remarkable project that you and Hannah have been stewarding. And I feel somewhat humbled to be asked to come and speak to so many training psychoanalysts and practicing clinicians. I want to sort of provide some background and then context for the remarks I'm going to make. And I'll try to stick to the 15 minutes, but I may very well go over a bit. Of course, as Wendy pointed out, I'm trained as a comparativist. I was trained as a comparativist in the 1980s. I took my degree from the University of Minnesota in 1990, and I studied with Vlad Godzic. And at that time, of course, Minnesota was a powerhouse of comparative literature and literary theory. And in Godzic's seminars, I had the opportunity to study with Lyotard and with Sam Weber. We were part of our curriculum. I was going to say required, which is true, but it was more of a collaborative work than some sort of dictate given us, was to study all of Lacan's seminars in the French. And from there, we went into readings of Klein, and indeed some of my colleagues ended up going on to train to become psychoanalysts. And one of the reasons for this, of course, was the ways in which our program emphasized semiotics, which is how I identify myself, in narratology, and that linguistic term, and the ways in which the concerns about the symbolic in psychoanalysis were really quite resonant with the question of systems of signification and narrative in the theory that I was being trained in. So there's overlap in training. Now what I want to talk about today, to give a bit of the context, is of course the charge, which is Fred's essay, The Mystic and the Group. Although I'm going to focus a lot of my comments on Bion's remarks, the remarks that Fred attended to. And I know when Fred presented his own account of his paper, he talked at some length about his critique of the concept of individuation. And as Wendy pointed out, he and I have had a long, interesting conversation about that. What I want to focus on today, however, is the family, or the question of the group. And I want to focus on it from what for me has been a fundamental point of departure, going back to 1968, when I first began reading Fanon under the tutelage of the Black Panther Party. And that's Fanon's critique of the Freudian ontogeny with respect to the question of the family. And that critique really asks whether or not it's insofar as one is concerned with something like the phenomenology of analysis, if it holds to presume the family as the primary site of socialization in the context of populations that are not so constituted. In other words, Fanon's sort of critique of the Freudian naturalization of the bourgeois family formation. And in that context, I take a particular point of reference from Sylvia Wynter's important piece on socio-principle, in which, forgive me, she quotes me. And that's when she points out the significance of Fanon's turn to the sociogenetic as an augmentation to the philo and the ontogenetic, but then she makes the harder point that once you introduce misogyny, you have to reconsider precisely the whole concept of society, let alone the whole concept of the individual in relationship with society. In other words, as she says, this calls for a prognosis different to that of psychoanalysis, the goal of which is to indeed adjust the individual to society. Instead, since society, the social order, cannot unlike biochemical processes, escape human influences. And I take that to be systems of reference. Seeing that it is the human itself that brings society into being, with the social order therefore never pre-existing our collective behaviors, our collective practices and creative activities. The prognosis is that of overall social transformation, and as such, the cure is in the hands of those who are willing to get rid of the worm-eaten roots of the structure. And it's this relating of the socialized nature of the individual subject to the production and reproduction of the social order itself that will lead Fanon in a later chapter to further challenge the ostensibly autonomous notion of the family. That is the familial concept central to the Freudian concept of the editable complex. As Ronald Judy notes, when Fanon had elaborated the concept of identification, according to his reading of Lacan's mirror stage, as one in which the ego only takes on its specificity after the Oedipal passage, he was to be nevertheless emphatic in asserting that the Oedipal complex is far from coming into being among Negroes. So that's one of the point of references for what I'm about to say. Another point of reference is Fred alluded to the question of deprivation. I'm particularly interested in what Bion has written about memory and desire, and Bion's focus on what he understood to be the phenomenology of analysis, and what's at stake with regards to certain presumptions about the very nature of the social in the project to arrive at the binary, in the project to arrive at a situation of a certain kind of sensorial deprivation, in which the truth, as you all know, that was his concern, the truth can come to the fore, and from there one can work towards anything like an analysis. And in that regard, a couple of questions come to mind for me, and I want to explore them in some detail with regard to, with reference rather to Lacan's notion of le paraître. Those questions are, well, first it's a question and then there's an assertion. And the question is, what does it mean to be possessed of collective memories of the ancestors, that they need to be somehow shared? The assertion is, deprivation of the sort that Bion seeks achieves the individuation of the analyst by negating the force of the symbolic by way of losing memory and desire, which are not only always sensory, but in that sense, sensorium, communal, being together in common. So the thrust of my remarks today are about what is the concept of being together in common that attends psychoanalysis, and to what extent is that concept possible with regard to the Negro analysant, if we take seriously the fact that there are indeed social configurations. And so I'm trying to make a distinction between a very particular conceptualization of being that underlines psychoanalysis, which I call the ontological, and I'll try to demonstrate that through a few remarks about Jacques Lacan, and another concept of being that I call the parasemiotic. Now, this notion that Lacan calls le paraître, meaning the being para, that is being besides, l'être à côté. In this notion, he takes care to note that he is saying par-être, and not its homonym, paraître, which is used in the philosophical sense of phenomenal appearance. Translating the German, Erscheinungen, beyond which there is supposedly the noumena or thing in itself, Lacanian paraître then, the being para, is neither phenomenal or noumenal, but rather has to do with the way the question of being presents itself in the paradoxes springing up with respect to everything that manages to be formulated as the effect of writing. Now, I should have remarked that the passage Sylvia makes reference to comes out of my reading of L'expérience vécue du noir, the lived experience of the Black. which is the proper translation of the chapter that usually gets rendered as the fact of blackness. And experience is what's at stake here, as it is for Bion in his trying to get at the phenomenology of analysis, the ability to attend to experience. And those of you who know his work know that as with Breton, his own experiences in the war were a driving factor in his elaborating this phenomenology. That's no small moment, but I'll just note it and pass on. So in this sense of the paradoxes springing up with respect to everything that manages to be formulated as the effect of writing, what's at stake there, I think, in the Lacanian project is precisely trying to write experience. And I say that very deliberately, and hopefully I can elaborate what I mean, and if not in my remarks, then in the question and answer. So as such, it indicates the contingency and the materiality of the letter, uncovering its envers, its other side. And the work then of Lacan's Paraître is expositing a discourse of being that, while not ontological in the strict sense of a particular philosophical project, that is the project of the study of being qua being, has a lateral relationship to it, which is signified precisely by the preface para. Now, two crucial insights obtained here, I think. The first is that even though there is some confluence in the attention given to the dynamics expressing system and subject, the grammar of discourse, between the use of para in the Lacanian paraître and in what I've designated parasemiosis, there is also a conceptual difference, one which is remarked, with Lacan saying, what we must get used to is substituting le paraître, the pure being, le être para, the being besides, le être à côté, for the being that would take flight, fuir. The reference being that would take flight is akin to Krakauer's fleeing bourgeois traveler. But I want to say that this being in flight is not to be confused with what I'll call quickly the Negro being in flight. And I have a particular in Sentient Flesh lengthy exposition of an example of this in Du Bois' short story of the Coming of John, in which John Jones emblemizes this sort of being in flight. Krakauer's traveler flees from mechanized capitalist commodification in order to redeem the inherent integrity of being that has been lost to it. Negro being in flight is being in a positionality, and so is neither a flight from capitalist modernity nor towards redemption of a lost self. Now, just a note bene, again, it's not of any small moment that Breton, as we know, who's also a practicing analyst before he became a surrealist, but Bion, the list is long, Krakauer, the Frankfurt School, we're dealing with what Husserl called the crisis of European science, which was, of course, manifest with the First World War, and a particular kind of massive social trauma. So much that Breton would characterize the very nature of modern society as being psychotic. The Negro in flight that I'm talking about, that trauma is not definitive. And in fact, there's a foundational trauma, if we can call it that, and I mean deliberately, if we can call it that, that's constituted with the very possibility of Negro being. And so the order of being is always in a position, not opposition to such traumatic structures, that achieves certain formulations, including the familial, that do something else. And we can talk later about what that might be. Now, this conceptual difference is crucial enough that there is a fundamental incompatibility between parasemiosis and the Lacanian le paraître. And that incompatibility lies in the particular lineage of mid-20th century Franco-German thought. Beginning in 1927, and that is tractable by way of Lacan. And we cannot sufficiently appreciate what is at stake in the difference without carefully considering that lineage guided by a set of questions. And the first of these has to do with the putatively universalist discourse, whereof being has place. The discourse known as ontology, which Lacan's Être seeks to challenge with a kind of displacement. The challenge involves questions of the transcendence, the worldliness, and the historicity of being, all three of which turn on the relationship between being, self, and things, prompting an adjusted version of Fred Moten's question. Actually, it's the fourth of four questions. What is the relationship between thingliness, worldliness, and the semiosis of human living in common? Now, in addressing the question of displacement of being, Lacan's Être, as the effect of writing, seeks to exorcise the philosophical ontological use of the copula as an isolated signifier. And it suffices to do so, Lacan suggests, by simply considering that when we say about anything whatsoever that it is what it is, qui ce soit, que c'est ce que c'est, excusez-moi, qui ce soit, que c'est ce que qui c'est, que c'est, qui c'est. Boy, je suis très fatigué aujourd'hui. I'm sorry, I'm messing this one up, but you get the gist of it. Nothing in any way obliges us to isolate the verb to be, être. To make this point, he proffers a pointedly French play on words that is pronounced c'est ce que c'est, it is what it is. And as such, you'd have to see this visually because he writes it out in a kind of funny way. C'est que c'est, right, is the wisdom. And his point in that transcription being that the only reason we see meaningful relation in these enunciations is due to our use of the copula. Without it, we would see nothing at all. And the only reason we see something with the copula is because the discourse of the master, maître, of the to be myself, maître, has emphasized the verb to be, être, and imposed it upon us. Philosophy, accordingly, epitomizes the discourse of being as the master of myself, maître, of being me to myself, maître à moi-même, which is what Lacan calls jeu quatrier, I-cracy, meaning the myth of the ideal I, the and the I that masters. His quip about c'est ce que c'est is in reference to the scholastic rendering of Aristotle's two phrases. It's always difficult when the computer is smaller than it's supposed to be. Toti este, that is what it is, meaning the non-qualitative property of a thing determining its individuation, and toti e inae, that which it was to be a given thing, meaning the generic qualities of a particular thing shares with other things as heicity, thisness, and quiddity, whatness, respectively. In a contradictory usage of the scholastic terminology, however, Lacan construes toti este as quiddite, quiddity, maintaining that Aristotle set this in opposition to the entity, designated in the phrase totein inae, the what it was to be a given thing, which he translates as what would have been produced if that which must have been tout court had come into being. Now, Chessy has pointed out that Lacan's identifying quiddite in this way, which is really a mislabel, is in fact para-ontology, and that from which it is differentiated ontological being. He aims to distinguish philosophical ontology, and I would simply call this ontology, as the discourse of the masterful I that has inscribed itself into which the richer field of language in an effort to master the universe. I am the master of myself, as I am the universe, from other discourses running beside it. The aforementioned being beside, l'être à côté, or para being, para être. And of course, we know here, you know very well, this is Lacan's effort to have psychoanalysis displace philosophy. And indeed, what Lacan proffers as the autre lecture, the other way of reading, psychoanalysis is the anti-philosophical other reading of being, which never leaves off being at the heels, at the order of the master. And he tries to slip that yoke by focusing on the function of the written in analytical discourse, by reading being as a letter, A, which he then makes a function of the proposition that only takes the form of a written. And he has this long pay on the long. I'm mindful of time, so I'm not going to go into the details of it. But I'll remark it's quite interesting that beyond his own writings, for all of his effort to try to attend to the phenomenology of the psychoanalytic experience, and his resistance to the mathematic, like Lacan, leads to such formulaic constructions, right? And my point there is that that tendency is somewhat inevitable because of the perception of the pair, because of the imperative to arrive at some clear moment of understanding that Villon will call the truth and Lacan will call the real. And of course, we know that for Lacan, his turn at this point is to set theory in a way to achieve this. So he really embraces the formulaic in a fundamental way. And we can have a long discussion about the imaginative formulae that Lacan generates. There's been a great deal written about it. It has its worth for all of its hilarious moves. And indeed, it's this identifying the letter with number and his formulaic of letters in the fashion of mathematical logic that marks the difference between what he's doing with Paetre and what I think is at stake in the historical constitution of anything like the Negro. So the emphasis has some bearing on the distinction I'm making between the being beside of Paetre as para-ontology and the being in apositionality of parasemiosis. And at this juncture, it is clear the difference is not just about what is right of the para, but also the work of the hyphen itself, which is Lacan's innovation in the conceptual genealogy, underscoring the parallelity of something also in play with parasemiosis. Now, of course, for Lacan, the hyphen indicates both the break between philosophical ontology and psychoanalysis, but it also indicates their conjunction. With the break Paetre presents in the paradoxes of writing, we should learn to conjugate that appropriately, Lacan says, right? And of course, we know his play. I para M, je passerai, you para A, tu pares, he para is, il paraît, etc., etc. We para A, nous passons, and so forth. But this suggested conjunction, every occurrence of the suggested conjunction, every occurrence of the hyphenated par signifies both the distinction and correspondence between the elements of the two distinct domains of the meaning. So we get the pairing. And to the right of the par are the elemental signs. M, R, is, are, belonging to the domain of traditional ontology, the discourse of mastery, in which the verb to be is isolated as a signifier. And to the left of the par are the elemental signs, I, you, he, we, belonging to the domain of being articulated beneath the discourse of mastery. So continue to underscore the connection Lacan makes between mathematics and Paetre. You know, we could notate this in all kinds of familiar ways that take us back to the foundations of mathematics. And you know, what we have then is a risk. And it's the risk in this notion of Paetre of turning into some form of necessary ontology, so that even the psychoanalytic discourse remains on some level a discourse of the mastery. And this stems from Lacan's effort to renounce the reflective subject of philosophical ontology as the center of all experience, while at the same time conserve the category of the subject in order to renew it from the ground up, rather, as the function of irreflexive transindividual structure. So even in the object-oriented discourse, which owes a lot to Heidegger, and I'm not going to go into that long illusion of the object, this pairing structurally grammatically calls for a transcendental perspective of viewing, which precisely is the position of the effort to try to descriptively analyze the moment of analytic experience. It's a Pernian Geyer. And with that Perninagraya, of course, Lacan will bring us to what he calls the effect of the real. Now, for those of you who are familiar with my work, and I don't want to assume you are, I'll just say very quickly that one of the things I focus on in an important piece that Du Bois wrote in 1905, Sociology Hesitant, was the way in which he offered a critique of the transcendental subject, marking it as the Kantian subject, as a problematic for the objective practice of statistics. And he was a masterful statistician, and the practice of mathematics. And that was what he called the paradox of the calculable and the uncalculable. And the uncalculable falls very much in the category of what Lacan calls the real. Now, Lacan is critical, like Du Bois was, of the promise made by the great European traditions of ethical and political theory regarding the telos of human life, the promise of eudaimonia, happiness, in the fulfillment of human being, which Du Bois in his critique refers to as the summum bonum, and Lacan as the souverain bien, the paramount good. Giving Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics an important place in his critique as the most exemplary and valid analysis of ethics, Lacan pays careful attention to Aristotle's account of the reasoning subject's management of desire according to the deliberative contemplation, the theory work, what Aristotle calls the orthos logos, the right principle discourse. And of particular pertinence in Aristotle's expressly elaborating that this way of thinking or talking is the discourse of mastery, in the double sense of its being the discourse of and for the master, as well as the discourse of reason's mastery over intemperance, is what secures the ideal political situation for attaining happiness. The paramount good which legitimates the discourse of mastery is an expression of that very discourse, that very same discourse. In other words, it belongs to the symbolic order of the master as the signifier of its teleological limit. Virtuous men strive for the paramount good, and striving for the paramount good is virtue. And that's a bit nasty, but I think Billon's analyst stands in for the virtuous man in his commitment to try to arrive at truth and experience. All said and done, the only good Lacan recognizes is the price one pays for access to the truth of one's desires, the fixed vanishing point of desiring, that which he calls, paraphrasing Freud, das Ding, la chose, the thing. In the latter development in his theory of the three registers of imaginary, symbolic, and real, the real referred to the thing as the forever unattainable that resists all symbolization and cannot be signified by any signifier. Now, for me, this is an interesting problem and quandary, because Bion also is concerned with the impossibility to actually symbolize that experience and that slippage of language. And yet both Lacan and Bion persist in the descriptive gesture, persist in trying to name, describe the experience in the name of the cure. And this aspect of analysis, specifically of Lacan's analysis, can well be designated the logic of the signifier, where the true nature is repressed by denoting it in a chain of signs that indicate the signifier as the element that is lacking. Now, I want to situate the question of the group and the family as a fundamental moment in the formation of consciousness at precisely this site, right, of the possibility of chains of signification, and what happens when there are multiple possibilities. So multiple that any kind of descriptive utterance is rendered meaningless at the moment it's uttered. So I'm mindful of time, so I want to get to the crux of this. So I will look over the issue of Lacan's turn.
You can take your time. You're good.
Well, I want to be coherent as well. No, you have no idea what I've got here. Be careful what you ask for. If I take my time, we'll be here a long time. So one of the interesting things that Lacan does in terms of the question of the genealogy of this concept of Parapraxis, of course, is to invoke the truth in the way that Heidegger does, trying to get at the truth. And in trying to get at the truth in that way and invoking Heidegger, he makes an interesting sort of statement, which is a perversion, and a point of perversion, as always is the case with Lacan. And in that he remarks, there is no universal that must not be contained by an existence that denies it, further undermining philosophy by exposing, and here again is Lacan, that the stereotype that every man is mortal is not stated from nowhere. And this nullability, this claim that truth simply is, comes from nowhere. Indeed, the very claim that there is nowhere is an alibi created to legitimate the discourse of the master. There is no saying from nowhere, but only and always from somewhere, which is not to say somewhere is, but rather somewhere never is without saying. It is from that place where philosophical logic turns that the discourse of the master, and here's Lacan, must take great pain to notice what is its own quotidian source, that nothing hides so much as that which unveils. That truth, aletheia, equals Verborgenheit, concealment. Now, Lacan is alluding here to a saying of Heidegger's from Being in Time. Yet his use of Heidegger's neologism, Verborgenheit, to mean truth, is the exact opposite of what Heidegger says regarding truth as a way of saying. What initially seems rebuttal on Lacan's part turns out to be an outright reading, an insightful reading, indeed. The truth, aletheia, of traditional philosophical ontology does equal concealment, Verborgenheit, of the fundamental understanding of human existence. The unconcealment is achieved through Heidegger's existential analysis of that existence. However much Lacan's fraternity is with the deconstruction of traditional philosophical ontology, he recognizes in Heidegger's saying, he remains opposed to its project of renovating the philosophical discourse of mastery. And so the gist of Lacan's autonomic substitution of Heidegger's Unverborgenheit with Verborgenheit as the translation of aletheia is critical editorial engagement with Heidegger's project, effectively saying, stop the deconstruction. Lacan's dismissal of the renovative retrieval project notwithstanding, however, his embracing Heidegger's deconstruction of philosophy for exposing its long-standing project of concealing the nature of human existence, a primordiality psychoanalysis simply lets be, resembles to the point of evocation an earlier extended engagement with Heidegger's longtime friend and colleague, the mathematician Oscar Becker. The only thing that's important about Becker here is the ways in which Heidegger's project of phenomenology through Becker brings the concept of the primitive to bear on Lacan's notion of the real. And my argument here is that Lacan is indeed in his notion of a real, elaborating on that project. And one of the interesting points in that elaboration for both Becker and Heidegger and Lacan is the specificity of the opacity of the Negro. And more pointedly, of the opacity of the Negro system of signification. That there's a system of referentiality and of meaning and of worldly production that simply is not subject to the analysis. And on this, Heidegger is quite emphatically in admitting this, right? Although that fact does not at all slow down the project of the analysis in the least bit. Now, in that respect then, and here I am going to wind down, The project of Parapraxis is all about the body, because it is still invested in somehow adjusting the ontological project. And the ontological project is about the body because it cannot think with the flesh. All of this is fundamentally about precluding thinking disorder. And in that vein, the para-ontological project of Parapraxis and its concern for the body's priority over the soul still postulates that it is the spirit, the Geist, which is driving civilization. Now, this brings to mind a story about body and soul told by the ethnologist Maurice Lienhart, reporting on an exchange he had with the venerable Kanak sculptor Besu, with whom he had become quite familiar during his time as a missionary in New Caledonia. Now, Lienhart tells of wanting to measure the progress made in the Konk thinking as a result of his long years of instructing them. And with his intent, he made it a presumptuous suggestion. All said and done, it is the notion of spirit that we Christians have added to your thinking. To which Basu retorted, the spirit? Bah, you did not bring the spirit. We already knew the existence of the spirit. We were already proceeding according to the spirit. But what you did bring us was the body. True to ethnological form, Lienhart must explain the significance implied in the response. The soul Besu refers to is not the Cartesian qua Christian esprit, but the Caledonian ko, which corresponds to the mythical and magical ancestral influx. And he rather blithely disregards the rhetorical force of Besu's contradictory retort, ba, as well as the irony of his subsequent but, construing the entire response as acknowledging receipt of the firmly delimited personhood precluded by the diffusion of the Konk social mythical domain. In Lienhart's deft exegesis, Basu's response is evidence of what the Konk had done with the Christian knowledge he imparted to them, creating a new synthetic understanding of human existence, combining the circumspection of Ko with the epistemology of the Cartesian. Now, I'm going to stop here for a moment. It's not near the end, but it's a good provocative point to start. Because the point I'm making, this analogy I'm making, is Basu's making a very specific claim that the concept of the integral person that you're trying to present to us is a result of you're giving us something we didn't have before, the body. And you're forcing upon us a specific discrete embodiment of being. This historically is analogous to the constitution of the Negro as a particular embodiment of energy. And in both the New Caledonian case and in the case of the various African populations liquidated into becoming the Negro, there was a different conceptualization of being, a different conceptualization of self that was divisible, that was not embodied. And in fact, that often in their many numerous historical cases amounted to a kind of fragmentation and divisibility of the flesh itself in order to achieve an embodiment that was combined and collective. We could call the first instance of that combining or being together in common the familial. We could call it that. There's something to be gained in calling it that, while at the same time recognizing its inadequacy. But it gives us a point of translation. We would say family, then of familius sera sûr, sûr et sûr, excuse. But the point I'm making, however, is that it is the imposition of the body, which is fundamental to the very practice of the cure, and hence inapplicable to those cases where there is no such embodiment and no necessity for embodiment. And that, frankly, is how I've always read Fanon's remark in that little book that he first submitted as his dissertation for his degree in psychiatry, but which he was told he couldn't submit and pass. And that was, of course, Pour Noir Masque Blanc, and where he was trying to elaborate precisely these issues, which is why he was told it wouldn't pass. And that is the passage where he says that the Black has no ontological resistance for the white, which is not a statement of the Black's desiring ontology, but precisely the fact that the way the Black is cannot be captured by the ontological discourse. Or the other passage where he says that the Black has no ontological being, which is not a statement of lack, but rather a statement of a way of being that cannot be described at all by the ontological project. And in his own clinical practice, his being Fanon's clinical practice, he became very much concerned, of course, with the symbolic, and with the symbolic in its materiality, not in the abstract. So, you know, even though he was never successful in learning Arabic, he came to rely heavily upon his Arab translators, and he found ways of arriving at some sort of social reintegration through the practice of Arabic symbolic forms, music, dance, works, on populations at the hospital, the Benoît hospital, that were deemed by the French psychiatrists as being beyond redemption, because they were using bourgeois configurations of the symbolic, which were completely alienating to those populations. So he was attending in his own clinical practice, leaving aside his horrendous violent experimentations with induced hypoglycemic coma, to a kind of here I always pause, because the term that comes to mind is a problematic term, and there's a whole series of them that come to mind. They're inadequate. The divisible person. Of course, the problem has to do with the long juridical history of person and persona. The self, again, fraught, and the subject. And to be quite frank, every time I want to use those terms, Fred Moten's voice starts whispering in my ear, you can't say that, you can't say that, you can't say that. And then agreeing with me, but we can't say anything else. So it becomes, well, you can't say that without 3 pages of qualifications as to why we're compelled to say it. But the gist of it is that Fanon was attending to the reality of populations whose social configuration, and hence the articulation of their individuation, which is a term Fanon uses, not in the sense of a pre-given inherent subject that has a certain relationship to truth, but in the sense of a particular articulation of a complexity of social discourses, what he calls the sociogeny. So those are my remarks. I suppose I should clean up by saying what they have to do with my opening comments, and make it clear my point of engagement with Fred's work and the work that you've read. The point of engagement is I want to push harder on the question of individuation than Fred does, by pushing harder on the question of family, of group. And there's something about the mystic that I find engaging. If one approaches the mystic, and Bion suggests this in many of his clinical writings, as a form of what Spinoza would characterize as prophetic imagination. I mean, there's this quib that Bion makes, which has to be sarcastic, that, you know, the mechanism of psychoses requires a genius to make sense of them, thereby suggesting something prophetic about the analyst. I think that's a quib, because it comes in a paragraph in which Bion's making very clear as well that there's a constitutive relationship between that mystic and the group, such that they co-articulate. So the imagination I'm talking about is the articulation, I would call it the function, of the ongoing semiosis that constitutes sociality. And that moment of what Fred and I both call the solo, that moment in which there is that mystic articulation, is a function of the system of referentiality, and not the function of some sort of inherent consciousness or individuated consciousness that is a priori. I think I'll stop there. I hope I've given you enough that's coherent enough that you can make some sense of this. And if not, I'm sure in your interrogation of me, you'll force me to greater coherence.
I think that was coherent, if quite difficult, but really helpful at the same time, if it can be all 3. We'll take maybe a couple questions and then pause for 5 minutes, break out into groups, and then return. But just, there was a lot there. So if anyone has any immediate questions before we break out into small groups, feel free to raise your hand or or put it in the chat.
Look, if you've read my work, you know I always come with a lot. That's just my nature.
I was prepared. Yeah.
You attribute it to my degree in comparative literature, but no, it has to do with the disorder of my mind.
I actually don't, because I now have that degree and I don't bring the same thing to the table. So any questions out there?
Wendy, I have a question. Can I ask?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Judy. That was really wonderful. It was really it was at 70,000 feet. So I was like, but I was trying to take as much as I could in. I was wondering, I wanted to read this quote from Fanon, which is kind of adjacent to the things you're talking about, and maybe give us something to also work with is to ground some of this stuff, or at least for me. I don't know how other people feel, but there's this quote in Black Skin, White Mask where he says, where he kind of like announces kind of the project of doing clinical and political work kind of in coordination with one another. And he says, what emerges then is a need for combined action on the individual and the group. As a psychoanalyst, I must help my patient to consciousness-size his unconscious, to no longer be tempted by hallucinatory lactification, but also to act along the lines of a change in social structure. And I love that line. I think it's, it seems to me like a kind of imperative to do about, if you take the notion of sociogenesis seriously, and you take the more sort of radical notion of the zone of non-being, and these questions about ontology and the place of the Black man and the system of referentiality that you're talking about, like, what would it mean then actually to do this combined action, right? Both at the level of the individual and the group in psychoanalytic work, right? But then also in political work. And I think broadly, this is what the Psychosocial Foundation Parapraxis is about, trying to figure out like how to work on those parallel tracks in the clinic and in society and see where they meet, but
the key.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm
No,
sorry.
please. No, you're totally fine.
Yeah, I know that passage. It's a very important passage.
Yeah.
And I think the point of important interrogation is, what is lactification?
Yeah.
Right. Most readers, including David Marriott, just skip over that.
Yeah.
Right? What is la siete? Right. And this moment in which he's writing, he's contended with his constitution as a Frenchman. One of the things I've been trying to begin to explore, I've been trying to begin to explore it for going on 10 years now. It's been a slow process. Is the extent to which there are traces of Martiniquais folklore and song in Fanon's writing. I went to the archives in Breton back in 2016. The very week that Jean Khalifa's book came out, right? And I was there at the book opening and bought a copy, and I was heading on my way to the archives. And it's amazing the amount of creative writing and clinical notes that didn't even make it into that book that are there. And there are traces in there. I mean, Fanon was obsessed with Chester Himes in a very major way. Mm-hmm. And there are indications there of a tremendous investment in the folkloric, for lack of a better term. I'm going to get rid of that term in a minute. And of course, there's the other passage where he's talking about the American Negro, and he talks about the need for there to be comic books, right? Black comic books, right? My point is that in that passage you're citing, what he's alluding to is the need for the creation of, or the discovery of, or the engagement in and with, as an analyst, historical forms of sociality that are not at all accounted for, even in the ontogenetic project of Freud. And that plays out in his clinical work in Algeria. It also plays out in his politics in Algeria and the concept he shared with Abbas Ramdan, and that is the articulation of polity must come from the masses, and not from a vanguard. That there is an emergent intelligence, or as he writes in 56 from the Mali front, that we have to come up with a new conceptualization, that the days of the European are over, he writes. This is his field notebook. And the danger before us in Africa is that we have to come up with a conceptualization that's quite different, Otherwise, we'll degenerate into tribalism and religion, and modernity will reassert itself with tremendous violence. So that need to get beyond lactification is what's paramount in that practice, right? And that's the conjunction that you're talking about. That's the point of confluence.
Yeah.
Right. And that would mean really rewriting psychoanalysis. And as you know, in Italy and in France, there are a number of schools of clinicians who, in dealing with immigrants, are trying to arrive at some form of analysis that does precisely that, right? Which does not presuppose any particular kind of subject.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I want to open it up to other people too. I mean, I would love to just go back and forth, but I also want to let other people like ask questions. And
Yeah, maybe we'll take one more if anyone has before we take a 5-minute break and then break into small groups. And if there is one. Okay. So yeah, let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 2:05 and we can maybe take questions in the chat, or if people want to raise their hands or just unmute. We have a small group, so I think things will remain orderly even if we go that way. Any questions that got cut off maybe when we came back in, or things that remain unanswered?
Well, obviously, I want to hear what was juicy when you were cut off, but Tony has a question. Go for it.
Great, Tony, yeah.
Thanks. This might be irrelevant or unhelpful, and feel free to dismiss it. But I'm curious if you're aware of the practice of Bionian process groups and like group relations conferences, and the way that they attend particularly to racism and practicing kind of like articulating the experience of how racialization happens in groups like big and small. I would just love to hear if you've had experience with that, what you think about that, what you think about its usefulness, maybe with regard to like Beyond's delusions. Yeah.
Oh, I wish you would have asked that question in the breakout, because it was so pertinent to what we were talking about.
Yeah.
And the whole constellation of training analysts, right, and the perpetual deferral of the danger of countertransference, right, and I am aware of those groups. No, I've never participated in one. They seem a logical outcome of Beyond's effort to try to get at the experience. My awareness of them is introductory. I would almost say superficial, right? But in that superficial awareness, I sort of, because I want to go in there and actually sit in some groups to get a sense of what's going on, the dynamics, is that again the problem of deprivation is still at work there, right? And the presumption that this is the work that the analyst must do. Right? So racism becomes an object, right? And it approaches the psychoses when you know, I would say it's not. It's part of the social fabric. Right. So you know, I'm always skeptical about unconscious bias, right? Because I'm always concerned about the ways. What I find interesting about those Bionian groups, as with Bion and generative, as I said in the breakout, is the effort to narrativize the phenomenology of experience. Right? Which I have a simple name for that. Being at the crossroads. You know, I hyphenate the connections, which is why it's one name, or you know, singing the blues. Right? These practices of narrativizing the ongoing trauma that's, you know, the structure of existence is one of my You know, I play around with instruments trying to play, and I got a bunch of friends who are musicians, and we talk about this stuff. And one of my friends who's a bass player, he puts it crudely but eloquently. Life is fucked up. It's always been fucked up, right? So the trick is the stories you tell, and some stories are more enabling than others, right? And in some sense, I think that that's what Bion is trying to get at in his notion of therapy, which is why there's no cure, right? I mean, Alex raised this issue in Lacanian in terms of separation,
Mhm.
which in some sense is like the Bionian. There's no cure. There's no resolution, right? And at the end of the day, as the other Alex was pointing out, Alex Washington, it's all kind of a fiction that you know, the analyst is just working with the analysand to come up with a set of stories.
Mhm.
And if you treat racism as a barrier or a memory and a structural desire that must be forgotten, then I think you interdict telling stories
Mhm.
and historical stories that are at play. Right? As the bluesman would say, my woman done left me. Not she left me because I'm a jerk, she left me. You know,
Thank you.
I really wish you to ask that in the breakout.
There was so much to talk about. I don't think we ever could have had enough time. But,
Well, I'm saying that because I would have loved to have learned more from you.
well, I don't know how much I have to say about it at the moment, but that was helpful to me. Thank you.
There was a question before we broke out into groups, which was from Molly about the recent work that's been done, looking back at Fanon in the context of thinking about analysis with immigrants. Is there a reference for that, or is there anything anywhere you can point us toward to look
Yeah,
more
I'm
into
really
that?
bad on names. There's a very powerful school in Rome that's published a lot of work along these lines. I can't remember his name. He's been doing it now for the past 15 or 20 years, and very successfully. And there's another, he's a Daisy psychoanalyst in London who's been doing the same sort of Fanonian studies. But the Roman one has been really quite explicit in using Fanon's conceptualizations in his clinical practice to deal specifically with immigrants. And Molly, I'll be back in the States next Friday, but if you send me a note, an email note, I can send you the precise references because I have them on my computer at home.
That would be very, you know, that would be really helpful. It's right on what I'm thinking about, and I think, you know, that there's a lot there. Thank you.
And there's also I want to say it's Benreda, but that's not his name. There's also a Tunisian psychoanalyst in Paris who's been doing the same sort of work, both with respect to immigrants and both with respect to the needs for psychoanalysis in Tunisia.
Right.
And what it would look like. So again, if you send me an email, I'll send you the precise references so I don't send you on a wild goose chase. I'm sorry, I'm bad with names.
No, that's fine. I'm also thinking actually, because I'm originally from Australia and I'm interested in traveling and migration as it plays out for Indigenous people who are dispossessed of their land and the narratives that they develop or that they perform in this context of displacement and traveling, that's both tied up with and distinct from dispossession and colonization. So I don't know, it just seems like there's a lot potentially there.
That's interesting. I don't know anything about that. When you say this, they're traveling, they're leaving the subcontinent?
No, they're traveling their, you know, their lines of, you know, it's traveling within an indigenous mapping and an indigenous topography.
Yeah, okay. That's the fact that that's their cosmogony. They're always traveling.
Yeah, and it's often stories to do with escaping from even an indigenous familial law or something like that. So I just think, this it's very complex, and I think that's what that's what's so wonderful in the way you're thinking about these things, that they're playing on multiple registers. It's almost like jazz, where you've got these different chords, and on one level it seems to be a critique of white colonization and dispossession, but it's also a critique of kinship roles and structures that are oppressive within local indigenous contexts, I think. Yeah.
I'm only passing familiar with the stories. I always thought those stories were not just stories of escape, but also stories by which particular groups articulate themselves.
I think above all, it's
Yeah,
got it asserts a sovereignty.
and in relationship to the land.
Oh yes, but a different kind of way of thinking of land is something one travels, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I could. I'll send you these references if you send me an email. I mean, in the case of the Tunisian, one point that you might find interesting is his engagement with the notion of restlessness.
Restlessness, yeah.
Yeah, but
Thank
restlessness as an existential orientation.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, no, I thank you so much. I will do that. I will be in touch. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, Carlin, go ahead.
Something into the room. So in my group, we were spending some time with the part of the interview with Fred, where you're talking about the eventfulness of writing flesh, and with the notion of the perpetual imposition of the body, like as a continual trauma. And then we were kind of finding ourselves like, okay, there's the imposition of the body, and is body as a term, or a body, or bodies? We were kind of tripping over our language, I guess I would say. And so one question I have is maybe just a simple linguistic one of like, if the imposition of the body is continual trauma, is using the word body always referring to that imposition? Does that make sense?
No, that makes a good deal of sense.
Or is like the example of Juba that you were giving, like the beating, is that beating flesh and not body?
Yeah, that's beating flesh.
Okay.
I wish I had a better sense that you guys were reading the interview. I didn't know that. I would have spent more time discussing the interview. But no, it's a very clear question. It's a very difficult question. And it's a question I've given a great deal of thought to. At this point, I'm inclined to say yes, it is. And to explain it, I'd have to talk at some length about the history of the concept of body that we work with, and the way it's been bound up with very specific legal discourses and philosophical discourses. So, for instance, John Locke, in his essay on human understanding, will be quite explicit about the subject of reason, who's the subject that has natural rights, right? Is the expression of a particular type of body. And that's a very close paraphrase, almost a direct quote, right? And if you read across his corpus, it becomes clear what body he's talking about. Even though in that passage is presented in the abstract, just like he's talking about what a person is. And that person as the legal entity is an expression of that particular body. And so even in our current discourses, we want to return to the body as a way of overcoming the Enlightenment conceptualization of the abstract subject. In fact, that body is a coefficient of that subject. And so we end up reifying that relationship over and over and over again, right? And in so doing, we do precisely and Locke is only one example. Descartes is dealing with the same thing. We're doing, you know, the same thing they're all doing, which is overlooking the scandal of the flesh. So my short answer is yes, it does condemn us.
Excellent. Thank you.
I've
As I said,
awkwardly
I may
raised my
change my
arm.
mind. Pardon?
No, go ahead, finish, please.
I may change my mind, that's all.
Keep us updated. I have a question for you, to our STEM majors, but I've tried to, we were reading, we began with Proust and Virginia Woolf and kind of developed the concept of modernism, and then I didn't set the syllabus, and so I kind of observed that the structure of the course was such that we first read, you know, the kind of classic British, French, German modernist texts, and then moved into Arabic modernism. And when we were doing Virginia Woolf, I introduced them to Lacan and the mirror stage. There's this one short story, The Lady in the Looking Glass, where like everything's devolving into hieroglyphics, and then the postman is seen in the mirror, and then all of a sudden there's this like violent return to a kind of clear narration, and so language is sort of kind of like violently called back into some sort of firmer symbolic order as like the postman with his letters enters the mirror. And so I was introducing to them this concept of the mirror stage, and very basically, I really don't know Lacan very well. I was just kind of saying, you know, in the mirror stage, there's something happens, like you say, like, that's me, so I am I. Like, first you understand yourself as an object in order to confer back upon yourself that you're a subject. And then we started reading Zora Neale Hurston. And there's this moment where Janie, in Their Eyes Were Watching God, looks at a photograph of herself with a bunch of white kids, and she's like, who's that kid there who's not white? And then someone says, that's you. And then she realizes, like, oh, that's I. And my students were, I was impressed. They were like, oh, is this a kind of like Black Mirror stage? And I was like, I actually don't know how to answer that question, because in like as far as I know, and I don't know very much about Lacan, he was developing his concepts primarily on, you know, white French patients. But then when I was reading your interview, you mentioned that when he developed the concept of the mirror stage, he was actually looking at a Muslim patient, and that it presented a kind of problem to his theorization of the mirror stage. And so I was kind of wondering about how, I guess I kind of want to return to my students with like, oh, I actually asked this question for you a little bit, like how is the racial kind of remaindered in the idea of the, how is it or is it not, I guess, remaindered in his articulation of the mirror stage? And it came up sort of in passing in the interview, but I'm just curious to hear maybe a little bit more about your excavation of that detail. Here,
Fanon was on point, apropos
right.
the mirror stage. Yeah. It's not. It's not. My point, in alluding to Lacan's clinical notes, you know, the patients he was seeing at the time he was developing it, is that he remarks the necessity of, he begins to think more carefully about the relationship between the symbolic and the real, right? And suggest, in a way that Fanon and Fanon's teacher, the Spanish psychiatrist whose name escapes me right now, begins with an L, anyways, began to elaborate. And that is the materiality of the symbolic order plays a fundamental role, and the role that can short circuit the ontogenetic account of the mirror stage. And in that context, he suggests that for those Muslims, the discourse of Sharia, he doesn't know anything about Sharia, he posits this, right, would be a key element in being able to understand what's going on, right, in order to, but he doesn't take it up, right? He continues with his career to elaborate his formulaic prospects, which is why, again, Fanon was on point. Lacan doesn't. My point of marking his awareness of the need to do so was an indictment, right? He knows better in a fundamental way that sort of undermines the tripartite relationship that he tries to lay out subsequently. Right, so you can go back to your students and say, yeah, that's not the black mirror stage. There is no black mirror stage. Right, because instead of a moment that's going to lead to a particular kind of integration, that becomes a moment of profound problematization. Right, and of course, in The Rise of Watching God, it's a bit, Zora Neale Hurston's being a bit tongue-in-cheek about it.
Right.
Right, because Janie has not disintegrated that realization. Oh, that's what you guys have been seeing, right? Which is a nice distinction. That's not, it's not, I'm not seeing myself there. Well, that's what you guys have been seeing. Okay, that's I. Oh, all right. That's cool.
Wendy, I wanted to say something about this and to kind of riff on what's being said, which is Lacan has this great line in the 11th seminar where he says, where he tries to talk about the symbolic and the real in the imaginary. And he says, the line is, you never see me from the place that I see you. That there's a symbolic castration in the imaginary, right? Which is that there's a non-rapport in the imaginary where you see the other person from and where the other person sees you. There's a disconnect. There's not a full circuit. Like the mirror in the earliest formulation is presented as this circuit where you can say, there I am that, right? But actually, as he refines it, there's a disconnect, there's a gap, there's a dehiscence, there's a moment that doesn't work. And it really does play out in this kind of visual register between people where you don't see me from the place that I see you and vice versa, right? So I guess that's how I think about these kind of moments of incommensurability of the visuals.
That's nice.
Yeah.
That's this point of the turn, Lindbergh. But well, he has that wonderful moment, but it gets buried in the formulaic.
Yeah, always. Always. I mean, right then that is a problem. Lacan insists on the formalism so much that he loses the experience, which I feel like is the thing that you've been saying to us.
Yeah, well, precisely in that seminar, it's for me, it was always very clear at that point, right? He recognizes what he had already seen in his earlier clinical work, that it doesn't work, that his project is slipping back into a mastery, but instead of pausing there, he doubles down. And for him, doubling down is going to greater abstraction.
Right.
So it almost becomes incoherent, right? But in the Jamie story, it's, yes, you never see me, from the place where I see you. This is Fred's wonderful thing about no place. And my remark, which was a pun on Lacan, right? There is no nowhere, you're always somewhere, which is to say somewhere saying. Right? And frankly, the inspiration for that, I'm riffing on the 10th century Arabic book of grammar that we had to study by Sebawiyya. In fact, it's a short story. It's worth telling if you'll indulge me, right? So Sebawiyya was a Persian. Sebawiyya means sweet breath, right? And this is the period of the tremendous Arab expansion. And he was studying in a circle of a famous grammarian. And when he was first doing his studies, they made fun of him because of his accent. And he couldn't pronounce the Arabic terms right. This is the lingua franca, the lingua of power, right? So he really, really invested himself in his studies to master this language profoundly, which he did. And the result of this was this huge book. It's called The Book of Grammar that he wrote. And in the Book of Grammar, he began to understand something fundamentally, that's the relationship between the symbolic and the imaginary, right? That language is always social and it's always psychological. And what's at play in the psychology is the articulation of co-positions. We would translate it as the subject and the predicate, right? But he says that the subject is always a position of speaking and the predicate is always a position of hearing, and the two are always there simultaneously. And you can't achieve grammaticality without that fundamental understanding. So that remark about, saying no where is always in saying is to mark the fundamental communicability, the commonality of that utterance. Lacan's statement in the 11th seminar elides that. He makes it this kind of rupture, right? Where in fact it is indeed what I call a being beside, which is where he should have taken pas être. Instead, it's being together, beside, not in spite of, not over.
That makes a ton of sense. Thank you.
I'm not the first one to point this out. Lorraine Chessy pointed this out as well. I mean, the thing about Lacan is people keep pointing it out, but the machine keeps going.
They should put that on the banner above Lacanian schools everywhere.
Didn't he write something like that?
Yeah, I'm sure he did. Well, no, he says that in the 17th seminar. He says, you don't know what you're protesting, but you're protesting it, but it doesn't keep the thing from stopping, or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for entertaining all of our questions and for the amazing presentation at the beginning. This was really, really wonderful and helpful. And we've run a little bit over, but say it again.
I seem to have chased most people off.
No, I don't think so.
It always
It happens. People don't want to stay for the small groups. They just kind of want to sit and listen. And then so when we return, they don't know when to return. But since it's recorded, they can always catch the second half. But thank you so much for your time and for your patience with us and for I feel like I'm still kind of learning some of the language of how to address questions to all the different traditions that you're engaging with. But thank you for your patience and your generosity and your wisdom, and it was really helpful. And thanks.
It's been my pleasure, and I'm really humbled, as I said before, to be talking to analysts in training and clinicians.
Thank you so much.
So to talk to people who know what they're talking about, and I've learned a great deal, and I look forward to continuing conversations with you guys. This has been an amazing project. I've been following it through the summer.
Thank you. Yeah, and our first issue is coming out, so we'll make sure you get a copy. And
you guys are doing great. You're doing great.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Safe travels back.
Thank you.